Hello everyone, salam, adab, namaste, and welcome to today's event. We have a great panel today. Professor Akeel Bilgrami is going to be the main speaker. He is very well known to this audience, and nonetheless, I just let you know that he is a very senior professor of philosophy at Columbia University. He will be formally introduced by Professor Uday Mehta, who is a distinguished professor of political science at the City University of New York. And after the talk, a commentary will be given by Professor Prabhat Patnaik, one of the most distinguished economists in India, Professor Emeritus Center of Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And hopefully we will see Professor Ashish Nandi also, who has not joined yet. He is supposed to give the concluding remarks. Professor Ashish Nandi is one of the most well-known personalities in India, the leading social, political, and cultural theorist. I don't want to take much time because we want to listen to more speaker. So I invite Professor Uday Mehta for the formal introduction of the speaker and the theme. Thank you.
Thank you, Riaz Bhai. It's an honor to be introducing Akeel and being part of this distinguished forum. I've known Akeel for about, 25, 30 years. And as you see from the poster, he is the Sydney Morgenbesser Professor of Philosophy at Columbia. In terms of his educational background, he got his first BA from Bombay University. He then went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, got another BA, and then he went to the University of Chicago, where he got his PhD, I think in 1983 or something like that. He then taught for a couple of years at the University of Michigan, and then in 1985, I think, moved to Columbia University. Now, I don't know of any philosopher who has as extensive a range of expertise as Akeel does. Just to list some of the fields of philosophy that he's contributed in, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, but that's a separate thing. He has this other broad set of interests, which is what I'm familiar with, which is broadly under the canopy of political philosophy. And under that canopy, he has written on secularism, moral psychology, history, culture, and capitalism too. And that's what I'm going to say a few words on. I recently, a couple of years ago, I taught a course with him on Gandhi. And what struck me was how sophisticated his understanding of Gandhi is. For Professor Bilgrami, Gandhi is one of these figures who is theorizing about a cusp. He takes India to be at a cusp when he believes, that is Gandhi believes, that it can still go back to a certain kind of pre-modernism. and he associates, this is Akeel, associates that with the dissenting tradition in the 17th century. And I find that to be a fascinating claim. I'm also writing a book on Gandhi, and you know, I was thinking before this morning, what are my debts to Akeel? And I just, they're so extensive that I couldn't list them. In any case, I think I could be wrong about this. One of the many, many influential things Professor Bilgrami has written about Gandhi is an article that I first read, I don't know, in EPW, called Gandhi the Philosopher. And what Akeel did in this very important article was he identified what was distinctive about Gandhi's normative position, as distinct from other philosophers such as Kant, who have an abstract account of what makes things normative. So in Kant's case, the abstract account that governs moral action is what is commonly thought of as the categorical imperative. In contrast, for Professor Bilgrami, what makes Gandhi appear, what is the ground of Gandhi's normative perspective is a certain kind of exemplarity. So what Gandhi is saying to others is, look at me, look at the life I'm leading. And that's very, very distinctive from how other moral philosophers have thought about it, where they say, typically in the form of Kant, here is this abstract perspective, this abstract set of ideas, and if you want to be moral, you have to follow those. That is not how Gandhi thought. He said, according to Professor Bilgrami, he said, look at me. I am an example of what you should be, with the caveat that he doesn't use the word should. And I find that to be a strikingly original understanding of Gandhi. I mean, since I know Akeel so well, I should just conclude by saying he's a real cricket enthusiast, and he's passionate about music, Hindustani music, Western music, yeah, I leave it at that. Akeel, on to you.
Thank you, Uday. It's very nice to be here in this excellent company, and I'm going to really only talk about caste in a very limited context, which is Gandhi's views on caste. And so I should warn the audience that my interest is not going to be in some elaboration either ethnographically about the nature of caste in the past or today. It's the focus is entirely on Gandhi's views on caste, And I won't be talking in very much detail about the relationship between Gandhi and Ambedkar, which has been a relationship that has been an obsessive focus for many in the last few decades. But things that I say in trying to come to grips with Gandhi's views will obviously have a relevance for the relationship and the disputes between Gandhi and Ambedkar, and I'll speak briefly about those disputes at the very end in one particular context. So I just wanted to be clear about the fact that my focus is going to be really on coming to understand Gandhi's views. And I will begin on a self-conscious note. For some time now, I've put off writing on Gandhi's views on caste for my long gestating book manuscript on Gandhi's thought. The subject had become too fraught in recent years as a result of hostile criticisms of Gandhi, and I didn't trust myself to not get caught up in the ideological maelstrom in which anything one said by way of trying to merely even understand Gandhi's views will come off as a kind of apologetics, which I had no wish to produce, since for all my admiring interest in him, I'm not a Gandhi Bhakt. Indeed, as will emerge in what I'm about to say, he's sometimes quite wrong on the subject, as on others. What I'm certain of, even so, is that his views on this subject and his motivations in forming those views have not always been understood with the depth that they need to be. It's fine to find someone to be wrong so long as you get right what you think is wrong. And it is with that in mind that I will now give you a few thoughts which present the larger framework within which I think his ideas about caste must be understood. So these remarks are of a preliminary nature, as I said, merely frameworking the more specific elaborations that would eventually have to be made. I don't believe that we can come to grips with the subject of Gandhi and caste unless we situate it in his very deep anxieties about modernity, but in particular about capitalist modernity and the political structures of liberalism, which were, in his mind, surely accurately, an essential surrounding context of capitalism in the Europe of his colonial masters. Though, as is well known, Gandhi was not a revolutionary socialist, even a glance at Hind Swaraj reveals that he recoiled from capitalism every bit as much as Marx. And though, of course, his recoil was not based, as it was in Marx, on a deep and systematic diagnostic analysis of the tendencies of capital, he rather had a deep and systematic understanding of the effects that capital had on the culture and the cognitive mentality of a society and its peoples. So let me begin with two preliminary state-setting points. First, it's well known that Gandhi says again and again that he believes in caste, but not caste as hierarchy, perversely putting the point by saying that caste as hierarchy is a distortion of the originary Varna ideal. So what then is he contrasting caste as hierarchy with? One way to put it is that he believes in caste as heterogeneity, not hierarchy. I believe this is the right way to understand the great importance he placed on the need to retain the professional diversity of a society that is given to its people by the traditions of caste conceived non-hierarchically. The concept of heterogeneity is apt because for him, diversity of work and profession is one among the many other aspects of a general cultural diversity that he believed India's long-standing pluralism has always respected. But all this needs more patient exposition, which can't be provided unless we present the right framework for it, bringing out how diversity of profession and the wider cultural identities in which it traditionally nests stand in contrast with the straightening effects of capitalist modernity that creates a form of life which undermines the heterogeneity of a culture and then consolidates that by adopting a form of governance defined upon a homogenizing notion of citizenship. We mustn't forget that at the time when Gandhi was writing, the idea of a multicultural citizenship had never been articulated in political theory. That idea only surfaced with any self-conscious explicitness in our vocabulary in the last 2 decades of the 20th century to address the problems that had slowly emerged due to post-Second World War migration from former colonies into European nations. So all that Gandhi could appeal to was an unself-conscious pluralism that he claimed was everywhere present in Indian history, and his initial skepticism about some prominent ways of opposing caste hierarchy, such as most prominently Ambedkar's, were prompted by an anxiety that they relied on the liberal democratic apparatus of governance and citizenship that was essentially tied to a capitalist modernity and abstracted away from the plural cultural elements in India that he cherished. The second preliminary point of state setting that needs to be made is this. As anyone who's read Gandhi's evolving remarks on caste knows, he gradually shed his commitment to caste, even in these idealized terms I've been expounding, in the last decade of his life, famously writing a piece as early as November 1935 in Harijan with the title and message, "Caste Has to Go," thereby converging in many of his views with Ambedkar, though even with hopes of a different framework of thought than Ambedkar's unblushing adoption of the modern rubric of parliamentary legislation and liberal democracy. Once Gandhi realized that that rubric had gradually come to be central in the formulations of a national movement that was gearing itself to acquire statehood, a rubric forced on it by the Crown's constitutional form of concessions towards Indian self-governance in the 2.5 decades before independence, Gandhi altered his idealized stance on the subject of caste to adjust to that emerging rubric, even as he held out in his more visionary pronouncements for an entirely different and novel idea of state and governance. All this, therefore, requires us to integrate Gandhi's idealized philosophical stances with his evolving activism in the struggle for Indian freedom, an integration that's bound to be tense and ridden with ambivalence for the glaringly obvious reason that activism, unlike philosophical reflection, speaks to more contingent demands. So the tasks at hand are complex and subtle, hardly surprising when dealing with a thinker as complex and subtle as Gandhi, and a political arena as complex and subtle as the national movement he led. Let me begin on these tasks by providing a frameworking backdrop of Gandhi's attitudes towards caste by citing a remark he makes in a dispatch to Young India on December 29th, 1920. He says, "The beauty of the caste system is that it does not base itself upon distinctions of wealth possessions. Money, as history has proved, is the greatest disruptive force in the world." That's the quote. So we must ask, what does he think life is before this disruption? And what is the significance of the disruption for his conception of caste as heterogeneity? The idea seems to be that before the pervasive influence of money, different people are better or worse off in different respects. So inequality in respect X can be redeemed by a reverse inequality in respect Y. But money standardizes all this heterogeneous differentiation and creates a single measure of equality and inequality, and in fact generates inequality along a single dimension, destroying the heterogeneity of caste in its originally ideal form, where no disrespect comes from having different professions, and where all of work, whatever it may be in this differentiation, offers dignity to the laborer. Now, related to this remark, in an interview not long after on Nayi Talim, his philosophy of education, Gandhi dismissed the subject of economics, saying there is no such subject, and that it is an artifice that colonial rule would impose on Indian thinking and Indian education and curricula, distorting the relations to the world that Indians have for centuries inhabited. When pressed in the interview about whether such a dismissal of a subject of study means that he would go so far as to deny that there was any such thing as an economy, he replied affirmatively, claiming that all there is society and culture, not economy. These remarks are picking up on claims he had made first in Hind Swaraj, and like the rest of that work, they're remarkable for what they reveal, not just about his conception of education, but for how deeply probing his opposition to modernity was in its repudiation of the cognitive outlooks shaped by capitalism. In 1909, when he wrote Hind Swaraj, he thought India was at the crossroads that Europe was in the early modern period. And his shrill and harsh tone in that work reflected his desperate anxiety that India would seek to go down what he viewed to be the lamentable path of political economy and political governance that Europe had taken in the passage from its early to its late modernity. So we must interpret all of the remarks that I've cited above about money, economics, and the very idea of an economy as reflecting his understanding of what he thought existed before and after the passage of these developments that he lamented and wished to avoid for India's future. To claim that there's no such thing as an economy is, as he puts it, really to claim that prior to capitalist modernity, there's no such thing as an economy that is independent of society. Economy was to be equated with society, not to be seen as something standing apart from it. What exactly does that mean? Its meaning is related to what Gandhi takes work to be. When, as in India and in Europe too, for centuries prior to modernity, an economy is not something other than or independent society, work is not something that is undertaken for ends, that is, for making a living, rather than merely being a way of living. It only comes to be a means to further ends when money is erected as an object of a goal, something to be earned by one's work for what it can gain for us. It is this which then introduces the idea of an economy as an autonomous sphere, abstracted from life or living itself, and not determined exhaustively as it had been for centuries by the fabric of social life itself. In Indian society, according to Gandhi, the routine structures of existence were all there was that motivated human actions and work. There were no distinct economic motives. Not only did the millions of peasants that comprised Indian society simply do what custom demanded, or indeed what their masters demanded, even the masters, for all their possessions and privilege, only did what tradition and society demanded of them, whether religious, administrative, political, military, or courtly. Neither for peasant nor his overlord was there any angle or orientation that was properly called an economic orientation. Society and its demands on them were all that defined them. And the Gandhian anxieties about the development of towns and what they would bring in the future at the crossroads he claimed India was in. He thought that what occurred in towns was merely, as he put it, business. And the conduct of business, such as it was in 1909, was also completely inseparable from non-economic, social, and traditional concerns. It was not prompted by the idea of a generalized conception of gain. It is to shun precisely this generalized conception and to stress instead this ongoing and long-standing nature of Indian society that Gandhi undertook to comment on the moral and social lessons to be learned from the Gita. The lesson in particular that work must be undertaken as service and social duty handed down to one by custom rather than as something for ulterior ends of personal acquisition. Gandhi was not denying that human nature may always have been given to avarice. What he was denying in these remarks is that this aspect of human nature, of avarice, was never generalized in India into an ideology or an economic outlook. It is only when money acquires wide scope in society, he claims, that a new and distorting element is introduced, transforming the nature of labor. No longer does one person work for another for subsistence and sustenance, but rather monetization makes work into a measurable quantity, a commodity to be made available by one's own free will, selling it in something called a market, transforming the very idea of market from the traditional idea of a marketplace to the abstract thing that generates the notion of an economy and an apparently sophisticated subject called economics that studies it. Apart from labor, even the very idea of property is transformed, said Gandhi. Some members of Indian society certainly had tangible riches, jewels, fine robes, dresses, bullion, forts, armaments, etc. But once these come to be expressed in monetized terms, and a person's worth is measured with a number assigned to it, then this new form can be deployed with indefinite flexibility as investment for returns and profit. With these hitherto unknown motives for working for gain or deploying one's possessions for gain, the notion of an economy emerges and all of life is transformed. But no one's life would be more transformed, Gandhi feared, than that of the Indian peasant, who would be utterly dispossessed by this transition and made into a socially untethered laborer, moving from pillar to post in constant fear of destitution to sell his labor. This creation of the economy as a self-standing ideal, independent of social relations and the distorting abstractions that it visited upon the concept of labor and property and the living marketplace, was precisely something to be resisted by stressing the idealized conception of caste that he, in his early writing, refused to give up. So when he said that caste before its modern corruptions into a hierarchical system was just a Hindu ideal of a sort of guild differentiation in Kosambi's sense, this should not be understood as mere social conservatism, because it cannot, I claim, be understood independently of his rejection of the corruptions that came with the notion of making a living in a market society, when economy is now a self-standing thing independent of society. It's very interesting to note that Gandhi's views here are identical with how Adam Smith described some pre-modern and pre-capitalist societies, where, as he says, and I'm quoting Adam Smith, each person was supposed to follow the trade of his father and would even sometimes be supposed to have committed some sacrilege if he did not. Gandhi invokes Jataka stories to make the same point, and speaks of a social differentiation based on apprenticeship within families that acculturate one into its craft or trade. Members of different castes, in Gandhi's understanding, did their own particular differentiated work without hierarchy, as he put it, as part of their swadharma, without contempt for one another, and that work was an end in itself in accord with social norms constitutive of society, and the notion of an economy was not separable from any of this. To put it in a contemporary form of words, to retain caste was to resist the market ideal that undermined traditional social relations by setting up the freely saleable labor of atomized individuals. Now, we should draw a significant, even if obvious, inference from the fact that Gandhi never made any serious effort to present any detailed historical evidence, nor even any historical reconstruction of what he pronounced caste to be when he said caste is heterogeneity of the sort, nor of the form and manner in which hierarchical corruptions were first formed. He never bothered to do any of this. In the Gita, in the commentary on Gita, Gandhi had said he read the work not as history, but as myth and religion and poetry. But his disregard of history in the context of caste has a more sophisticated and quite different theoretical motivation. Even if we move away from his claims for the heterogeneity of caste to his more general claims about India's unself-conscious religious pluralist past, Gandhi never sought to present any serious historical evidence for this. In fact, Nehru's discovery of India is a far more conscientious effort to do so, despite the fact that it's not viewed as a serious historical work of scholarship. But it would be a comical form of misunderstanding to think that because Gandhi made no such effort by, for instance, a study of Harappan civilization and its successors and the emergence of the Brahmana caste conceptions in the way, for instance, Kosambi did, that he was some sort of brash and failed historian presenting a false empirical hypothesis. Rather, the obvious but significant inference to be made instead is that Gandhi, with this indifference to history, that Gandhi as a social philosopher writing on caste is invoking a conjectural past in a theoretical deployment of mythos, with the same theoretical motion as much more modernist mythos is invoked by any number of political philosophers who appeal to a conjectural past when they, for example, posit a social contract. No social contract was ever drawn up in history. It's not the point to present it as a historical occurrence. The idea, rather, is to set up a normative ideal by presenting it as occurring in a conjectural past with a view to exploring and critically assessing what did occur in history. The political philosophers in question explored and assessed notions of state and governance via the normative ideal of a social contract. And so also, it was Gandhi's purpose in setting up a normatively idealized conception of caste in conjectural history to explore the facts of caste hierarchy as we know them, and to assess the claims to progress in capitalist and liberal modernity as a path to overcoming caste as we've come to know it in the modern period. It is with a view to presenting a negative assessment of these claims for modernity to overcome caste issues that Gandhi posits the conjectural past of a non-hierarchical conception of caste. What does this imply for how we should respond to his own accompanying assertion that over the centuries, terrible discriminations had emerged between castes that corrupted it into becoming a hierarchical system? From the point of view that I've been expounding so far, where there is no economy but only society, Gandhi could only give one answer to this question about how to address the questions of caste as hierarchy. The problem of an emerging hierarchy was to be addressed by a society internally addressing and morally resisting its own corruptions, rather than by introducing a newfangled and extraneous notion of an economy in which each individual transcended the social embedding in caste and made him or herself available to something we now call the labor market. That would be to make it a commodity, and no longer would one man work for another in return for an assurance of sustenance and subsistence and belonging. If one, as an individual, freely sold one's labor to a buyer, and what one paid for it was not enough to sustain one, well, if what one was paid for it was not enough to sustain one, Well, no one was responsible for that in this new freedom to be found in such a system, certainly not the buyer. He had no responsibility over and above paying the price for the labor that he could get away with paying what came to be called the market. What happens next was no care of his. Gandhi's economic idea of a trust, something that could not possibly be expected to be implemented in a market system, so conceived, was precisely to ensure that that responsibility was not shirked in social relations. But such social relations were exactly what were undermined by the idea of a market, a self-standing idea of an economy independent of social relations. So for Gandhi, to generate such a notion of an individual freely selling his labor in the emerging ideal of a market was the wrong way of addressing the hierarchical distortions that had entered caste. Hindu society, read large as Indian society, qua society, not economy, must seek internal moral resistance to these hierarchical emergences. It's very important to stress here that Gandhi's idea of this internal form of social resistance against these hierarchical corruptions of caste was not the notion of religious social reform that had emerged in the last half century before he was writing, which were drawing somewhat schizophrenically upon the ideals of modernity, whose claims he was resisting. Rather, he was explicitly drawing upon much more folk and popular religious traditions, bhakti, including the early Varkaris, Gujarati Vaishnavism, as well as various Sant poets of Gujarat, and an assortment of regional sects and movements, which D. Nagaraj discusses in his excellent essay on Gandhi, such as Satnami and Mahima, to name just two, all of which sought reform entirely outside the modernist liberal categories with which India's colonizers had influenced this newly emerging, intellectually minded social and religious reformer. Moreover, he also made clear that such internal social and moral change to overcome the emerging hierarchies of caste is possible only in unalienated societies where individuals are able to think from a larger point of view than their own, just the point of view that is undermined by the relations that define the market conception of economy. If India were to address these emerging hierarchies that had contaminated the guild ideal of caste as diversified professions by turning to capitalist modernity, one would have to rely not on internal social change and resistance, but rather to what Marx called primitive accumulation, that dispossesses the peasantry, sends them, as Gandhi put it, from pillar to post to avoid destitution, migrating to towns defined by market relations, selling their labor as free individuals there in exploitative class relations, and in Marx's vision, forming new solidarities to resist such exploitation and thereby overcome the hierarchies that had emerged in caste relations of their erstwhile peasant existence. I still have in my possession a scribbled note by my father in which he said, "The machine will do far more than the Mahatma did to undermine caste by bringing different castes together to work on it." It is these claims of modernity that Gandhi instinctively denied, and I turn now to examine what those instincts were. In Marx's Part 8 of Capital, Volume 1, primitive accumulation is seen as the coercive, frequently brutal extermination of communities of a pre-capitalist form as a result of the deracination of petty producers, mostly peasants, from the sources or the means of their particular form of producing, and then morph into a proletariat, either in the form of metropolitan industrial laborers or a reserve army of the unemployed. These accounts, though they observe the coercive and brutal nature of this destruction of pre-capitalist communities, are nevertheless also presented by Marx and Marxists as their transformation into a new class formation in which the old hierarchical oppressive features of social life, whether caste or tribe or clan or religion, etc., are undermined, even if they're replaced by the newly minted oppressive features that tied to the specifically exploitative and alienation-inducing conditions that metropolitan capital imposes on labor. This is a large theoretical claim standing behind the simple and facetious entry in my father's journal. Now, it would seem that Gandhi's inferred conclusion from his own critique of capitalist modernity that caste hierarchies ought to be undermined by internal transformation without the destruction of pre-capitalist communities and transforming them into new class formations, that this in Gandhi amounts to a normative stance against this view of the leveling effects of primitive accumulation. There's one central aspect of what we regard as this normative stance, that you shouldn't destroy pre-capitalist communities to overcome caste. You shouldn't create new forms of community, such as is found in metropolitan industrial proletariat with its own solidarities. One should reform caste internally, internal social moral reform. This is one central aspect of what one regards as an anti-modernism, is social conservatism. Now, however we assess this normative stance that you certainly do find in Gandhi, what I want to focus on instead is a more descriptive instinct that Gandhi had in Hind Swaraj when he refused the relevance of Western frameworks of thought, including Marx's account of primitive accumulation, as being relevant to large agrarian societies like India. To expand this, let's first ask a counterfactual question about the effect that primitive accumulation had on European populations. That is, this dispossession of the peasantry of their land for capitalist projects. The effect this primitive accumulation had on European populations. Here is my counterfactual. Imagine the following scenario that is counter to fact. There is no settler colonialism that diffuses capital by moving vast numbers of the dispossessed European peasant population to various parts of the world, such as across the entire Atlantic, or to the Antipodes, or to the southernmost corners of Africa. In this counterfactual scenario, millions of peasants who in fact migrated to these places instead live and remain sedentary in Europe. What reason is there to think that these massively vast numbers of peasants would have been absorbed into a new community of industrial labor? What reason is there to think that they would be accommodated inside the domain of capitalist production? There's every reason to think that they would remain outside of capital's domain as a vast, residual, pre-capitalist community. How then would contemporary capitalism have characterized their place? What grounds are there for thinking that Marx's account of the effects of primitive accumulation would so much as apply to whatever characterization one would give of them? And so the crucial question arises, would they have overcome the oppressive, hierarchical, and divisive features owing to caste and other such ties? The tribal divisions, the deeply riven religious schisms that were typical of European society of the time. Just consider the fact that whole wars were fought for years on end over obscure religious issues such as transubstantiation. So really, I'm asking whether Gandhi might not have taken his normative stance about internal social transformation about caste, whether or not we agree with it, because of a canny understanding that in colonial and post-colonial capitalism, the colonized lands were the factual version of something that was merely the counterfactual scenario in Europe as I just presented it. To put it differently, primitive accumulation as it is presented in the canonical Marxist account depends, I'm claiming, not on the truth of a theoretical analysis, but on the observation of entirely contingent empirical features in European history. The fact of massive departure of peasant populations to other parts of the world as a result of settler colonialism. There could be no such analysis of primitive accumulation as Marx offers if these contingent empirical features were not also present. As a result, there's no reason to think that this particular section in Volume 1 of Capital amounts to a bit of theory at all. A theory implies the generalizability of its main claims, or a claim to some telos, or some structural explanatory power of diverse phenomena. But if I'm right, the account has no such properties. It is a local observation about European history over a span of time, a specific span of time. If you wanted a vivid example of what has fashionably come to be called the provincialization of Europe, Marx's account of primitive accumulation, as I'm reading it, seems to be stepping up to the plate. So what I'm suggesting is that Gandhi understood well that in the colonized lands, given quite different empirical features, that is, no prospect for large-scale migration of displaced populations as occurred in Europe because of laws that restrict such transcontinental migration, these lands simply cannot absorb the displaced millions as industrial labor. In fact, they're not even likely to be transformed into a reserve army. He understood with clarity that his people, the vast agrarian populations of India, are just simply superfluous to the kind of growth economy that primitive accumulation is supposed to have produced in Europe, overcoming primordial hierarchies and schisms. Thus, internal transformation to address caste hierarchies is not just normatively wrong, but it is made descriptively necessary because primitive accumulation would not lead to the emergence of a relatively liberated, even if differently subjugated, industrial labor in India. And instead, even industrial laborers would continue to be caught up in the hierarchical features of a pre-capitalist community, something we see everywhere in urban India today, and the politics of identity that surfaces not just in rural, but in metropolitan India as well. Just to give one example, sociologists have repeatedly observed that communal riots occur predominantly in cities, a symptom of the pre-capitalist community's metropolitan survival. Here then is where we are in the argument to understand Gandhi's attitudes towards caste. We have expounded as now that Indian society in 1909 was characterizable by an independent formation called the economy, and his insistence that in India, unlike Europe, it is society and culture and nothing else that defines our relations to each other and the world, as well as shapes our motivations that yield our public behavior. We then pointed out that though he had argued that those relations were once defined by an idealized set of caste relations in terms of professional heterogeneity, these were no longer so characterizable, but had admitted of deep and invidious hierarchies. This combination of points, we said, is what yields us inference that internal resistance within Hindu society is the only right way to address the hierarchies that now define caste relations. We then considered whether allowing for the very notion of an economy as an independent sector of human life that filled Gandhi with anxiety would offer an alternative and more progressive way of addressing these social hierarchies of caste, as is on offer on the standard accounts of primitive accumulation owing to Marx. And then with the aid of my counterfactual, we concluded that Gandhi's instincts were that quite apart from his normative recoil from these developments of capitalist modernity, these accounts were not theoretical accounts, but local observations of an extended moment in one continent of the globe, inapplicable to the large agrarian economies of the colonies of the South. So whatever we thought of his normative stances, they would not and could not, this capitalist transformation, address the hierarchies of caste that defined Indian society. So the time has come now to take up a question that I'd mentioned in my opening remarks. How do these philosophical and normative stances of Gandhi, the philosopher, relate to Gandhi, the central activist figure in Indian history in the first half of the 20th century, leading a nationalist movement against British colonial rule? Now, one way of approaching this question is to notice that Gandhi's philosophical stances about the relations between economy and society, read as I'm reading them, India in 1909 being at the crossroads that Europe was in early modernity, were remarkably similar to the stances taken by the Narodniks in Russia, who stressed an idealized version of their own pre-capitalist formations and sought to construct a populist nationalism based on a similar recoil from the capitalist incubation that European nations had embraced, seeking more direct routes to radical transformation in Russia than Marx had envisaged for Europe, at least in capital. Now, as we all know, Lenin had conducted a famous polemic against the Narodnik position. But what is not often noted is that Lenin had also made a distinction that is relevant to understanding Gandhi. In a paper entitled The Economic Content of Narodism and the Criticism of It in Mr. Struve's book, Lenin writes this, and I'm going to quote this passage because it's a very fascinating passage. Here it is. I make a distinction, Lenin says, between the old and the contemporary Narodism on the grounds that the former, the old Narodism, was to some extent a well-knit doctrine evolved in a period when capitalism was still very feebly developed in Russia, when the petty bourgeois character of the Russian nation had not yet been revealed, when the practical side of the doctrine was purely utopian, and when the Narodniks gave liberal society a wide berth and instead went among the people. It is different now, says Lenin. Russia's capitalist path of development is no longer denied by anybody, and the breakup of the countryside is an undoubted fact. Of the Narodniks' well-knit doctrine, with its childish faith in the village community, nothing but rags and tatters remain. In place of aloofness from liberalism, we observe an intimacy with it. And it is this change that compels us to distinguish between the ideology of the peasantry of the old Narodniks and the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie of the later Narodniks, who had become like Janus, with one face looking into the future and the other to the past with its obsolete social forms. That's the long quote from Lenin. What should be clear is that if there's an affinity between Gandhi and the Narodniks, Gandhi, in his own mind, would have viewed himself as falling under Lenin's characterization of the old rather than the later Narodniks. So the question before us is whether over the decades after Hind Swaraj, and more particularly from the mid-1930s on, Gandhi was altering his attitude towards caste because the contingent opportunities that the Crown was bestowing upon the national movement by constitutional concessions towards self-governance were forcing him to withdraw his, to use Lenin's phrase, aloofness from liberalism, and finding himself having to keep in step with and respond to Ambedkar's, to use Lenin's rhetoric again, intimacy with liberalism. This transformation of the national movement was not restricted to governance. What Lenin calls the Narodnik ideology of the peasantry, a label that in some crucial respects captures the Gandhian critique of capitalist modernity that I presented above, could no longer fully dominate the national movement. And Ambedkar was, from Lenin's point of view, par excellence, the face of what he called the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie, with its wholehearted embrace of the liberal democratic apparatus, an ideology whose effects on the national movement forced Gandhi into chronic ambivalences and steered him to his exquisite reversals on caste, because he was now rendered by these contingent developments into resembling the later Narodniks, who Lenin describes as Janus-like, one face to the future and the other to past obsolete social forms. Nothing displayed these ambivalences more than the events surrounding the signing of the Pune Pact. These ambivalences are more complex than the simple dichotomies of traditional and modern, peasant ideology and petty bourgeois ideology would suggest, because of the contingent demands of an anti-imperialist movement. Staying with Lenin's classical image, the Gandhian mask of Janus that looked to the future had to now address the issue of the representation of Dalits in electoral politics. This may give one the impression that it is the other face, looking to obsolete social forms, which exhaustively determined the stance that there should be no separate electorates. After all, didn't Gandhi say that separate electorates would undermine the unity of the Hindu people? But to take these words to be backward-looking in any simple sense is to misunderstand his motives, because that unity for him was at bottom the unity of the Indian peasantry in the freedom struggle, for which that unity of the entire peasantry was indispensable. Unlike the celebrated Russian Mir, Russian Commune, which was taken by both the marks of his last decade and the Narodniks to already reflect the promise of peasant solidarity in the fatherland, the peasantry in India, as Gandhi pointed out again and again, has to constantly struggle so as not to be divided by caste or religion. And it was this face of Gandhi, the peasant ideologue of Lenin's description of the Narodnik, who wanted the entire peasant class to be mobilized in the national struggle, which was motivating him just as much as any concern about a unified Hinduism. His Khilafat movement had been explicitly launched with a view to overcoming the potential religious divisions of the peasantry by involving the Muslim Kisans and the urban poor. And his resistance to separatist politics of caste that would emerge if he conceded to Ramsay MacDonald and to Ambedkar was just as much to preserve an undivided Hindu peasantry and nationalist mobilization. If he also made concessions to upper castes, which he did, till the caste must go phase of his thinking emerged later, that was also motivated by his goal for unity. It is surprising to me that none of the detractors of Gandhi's stand against MacDonald's communal award have linked in detail his motivations for opposing a separatist politics of caste, which would divide the Hindu peasant population, with connecting it with these motivations for launching the Khilafat movement that I've just mentioned, attributing to him only the motivation of preserving an obsolete form, the idealized conception of a unified Hinduism. All this I say by way of trying to get right the motives underlying Gandhi's Janus-like predicament and the stances they produced in the signing of the Pune Pact. I have not taken up at all the question whether Gandhi's stances were in and of themselves right. Irfan Habib, in a recent lecture, said with complete and confident conviction that they were indeed right on the grounds that the pact got the Dalits more representation than the communal award would have given them. I'm much less confident of this, and my reasons owe not just to Ambedkar's thinking on the subject, but paradoxically to an aspect of Gandhi's thinking as well. The issues here turn on the moral psychology of politics. Both Ambedkar and Ramsay MacDonald had made their moral psychological point very clear. They proceeded from the assumption that in the electoral field, social groups vote with nothing but their group interest in mind. Thus, if there was a general electorate, rather than a separate Dalit electorate voting for Dalit candidates in reserved seats, they would vote for those Dalit candidates who would best serve their rather than Dalit interests. Gandhi's opposition to this proceeded with a quite different and much more idealistic assumption. A group whose members are not socially alienated from each other will not vote with narrow factional self-interestedness, but vote from the point of view what is best for the worst off among them. This commitment to an unalienated society is, of course, what both Gandhi and Marx, coming from their very different political positions, had erected as an ideal. Gandhi's idealism on this matter is dismissed by his detractors, beginning with Ambedkar himself in that period, to the commentators of our own time, Perry Anderson, Christophe Joffrelot, and Arundhati Roy, that I mentioned in my opening remarks. Some of these commentators dismiss this moral psychology as the hypocrisy of a Brahminical hegemonist, Gandhi, a remarkable accusation against a man who worked at great cost to himself and eventually to his life for decades to oppose untouchability. But even those who do not make this accusation dismiss Gandhi's stance as being too idealistic. In-group, out-group thinking, they say, cannot be denied when it comes to parliamentary politics, and the face of the Jainist Gandhi that was forced to look to the future where such politics had been imposed by colonial rule was simply not facing up to the cynicism. My own view is that the failure of Gandhi's moral psychology of caste politics here is not that he fails to face up to the truth in the assumption that social groups always vote with their own interests in mind. There's no wholesale crime in holding out hope for a more idealistic conception of what human subjects are capable of. Rather, it is Gandhi's failure to acknowledge that social groups, even when they're not cynical in this way, too often lack the imagination to really grasp the detail of the suffering of other more deprived groups, and thus fail to grasp what exactly it is that will best serve their interests. It is this failing of human moral psychology, the failure of imagination, at least until an unalienated society is achieved, that makes me think that Irfan Habib's view of the Pune Pact is not convincing. And as I said, paradoxically, Gandhi himself, in various things he wrote, acknowledged the importance of guarding against the inadequacies of human imagination. He acknowledged it when he wrote in Young India in 1921. He says, "I would rather be torn to pieces than disown my brothers of the suppressed classes. I don't want to be reborn, but if I have to be reborn, I should be an untouchable, so that I may share their sorrows, sufferings, affronts leveled at them every day, in order that I may endeavor to free them from their miserable conditions." He acknowledged it again when he said in another dispatch in 1924, "We must first come and live in touch with them by working with them. We must be pariahs too, and see how we feel to clean the closets of the upper caste and have the remains of their table thrown to us. Then and only then will we represent the masses." Both these remarks acknowledge how much personal strife and striving there must be before one can rise to the imagination that is needed. But Gandhi quite simply failed to acknowledge and guarded against such failures of imagination when he insisted that we can rely on caste Hindus in a general electorate to vote for those Dalit candidates who will serve Dalit interests best. When ambivalences are forced upon someone's philosophical stances by the contingent demands of history on one's political activism, such failures are hardly surprising, and these ambivalences are unresolved to this day. Putting aside, I'm concluding now, putting aside the question of caste then, and speaking more generally, let me conclude by saying that the Leninist image of Janus for the Narodniks in their later phase, which I've invoked to present the ambivalence of Gandhi, looking back to the future when India landed with a bourgeois democratic framework for politics, while also acknowledging, looking back to a philosophical vision of politics and political economy that would appear obsolete within it. This has haunted Indian politics ever since. As early as in the National Planning Committee of 1938, the backward-looking face of the Janus Gandhi which was represented there by Kumarappa, was sneeringly sidelined by Nehru and his associates, who dominated the committee. Careening forward with visionary ideals derived from Soviet models of industrial development, summarily dismissing as obsolete forms of aspirations for development built up from a peasant base with decentralized governance. In the rest of that fateful century, 20th century, the only explicit representation of the peasant point of view in mainstream parliamentary politics at the national level came from a leader, Charan Singh, whose aspirations for the peasantry were wholly conceived within a framework of agrarian capitalist structures that Gandhi had struggled to protect the peasantry from. It is this complete failure in our nation's politics to formulate a politics of regard for the peasantry outside the framework of bourgeois politics, and its increasingly wholehearted embrace of late capitalist modernity that leaves us dangling to this day with completely unresolved questions about the peasantry's relations to a fragmented, impermanently employed, barely unionized urban working population, to say nothing of the unresolved questions of caste. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Akeel Saab. And I believe that your 50 minutes was okay. You needed more, or you're okay. That's fine. So now let's invite Professor Prabhat Patnaik, sir, for the concluding remark, or take as much time. I believe Professor Ashish Nandi is not here. So you have the time at your hand, whatever you can say. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, as one would expect from Akeel, he has given us a very rich paper, full of deep insights, and I am more or less in agreement with everything he said. Therefore, what I would like to do is to talk around the paper rather than on the paper itself. I think what is particularly interesting and noteworthy about the paper is the parallel he draws between Gandhi and the Narodniks. I think both of them saw capitalism as bringing essentially misery to the people, and therefore wanted to bypass capitalism by having changes in the pre-capitalist society, which were, as it were, internally propelled. In other words, the idea was the pre-capitalist society can lift itself with its own bootstraps in a way that you don't really need the impact of capitalist modernity to change it. That, as a matter of fact, the pre-capitalist society can itself undergo a self-transformation. Now, the Narodniks thought in terms of a populist mode of production, essentially based on small producers, peasants, and Gandhi too, more or less thought along very similar lines, with the addition that since the Indian reality was marked by an oppressive caste hierarchy, his belief was the caste hierarchy itself is something which can be transcended from within, that you don't really need capitalism. As a matter of fact, Gandhi argued, as Akeel pointed out, that capitalism would not be able to overcome the caste hierarchy. And we have seen that it has not been able to overcome the caste hierarchy, because obviously in these large agrarian societies, you cannot really have a situation where the bulk of the people get absorbed into an industrial labor force and form combinations amongst themselves, which are the harbingers of a new kind of collectivity that would really go beyond the existing ones. And because of that, you would find that the same caste hierarchies which existed earlier would once more appear in a new form, appear once more in a society that is being capitalistically transformed. Now, the Narodniks actually had entered into a very powerful debate against the Marxists of that period. Many of the Narodniks themselves relied heavily on Marx. In fact, as Akeel said, talking in terms of culture and so on, and much of the economic critique of Marx is in her accumulation of capital about Nikolaion, who was a major Narodnik thinker, that he has got his Marx right. And because of that, he uses Marx's volume 1 or 2 of Capital, 1 and 2 of Capital, to establish his point quite convincingly. So many of the Narodniks got their economic critique of capitalism and they derived it from Marx. But nonetheless, they actually differed from the Russian Marxists, because the Russian Marxists saw the Narodniks as essentially polarizing between two different ways. And I think that is that is as much true of Gandhi as well, that there is a way of capitalism bringing modernity and overcoming the social hierarchies. And there is a way of the societies themselves, the pre-capitalist structures themselves, as it were, transcend with the intervention of capital. Marxists were arguing is that the formation of the proletariat under capitalism brings in a sort of Promethean agent into the picture. They, of course, were idealizing the role of the proletariat, like most Marxists do, that it brings in a Promethean agent into the
I think
because of which there existed. In other words, it's not capitalist modernity, but the fight against capitalist modernity, which is done from a point of view of transcending capitalism, not bypassing capitalism, that would actually provide a way forward. Now, it actually so happened that in the Bolshevik Revolution, hi.
But I think your voice is breaking up, and somebody from the audience has just advised that I think you turn your thing off and come back on or something. But
No, just
turn off your video, then audio quality will be better.
Yeah, turn off the video.
Turn off the video, Prabhat.
Yeah. Turn off the video, then your audio quality will be better. Can you turn off your video?
Shall I turn off the camera?
Yeah.
Turn off the, exactly.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Is it better now?
Yes.
We'll see.
Fine. Yeah. You know, the Marxist position in that debate, people like Lenin and so on, was that it is not capitalist modernity that would actually break the old social structure, but rather the transcendence of capitalist modernity, because the resistance against capitalism, which is carried out by the newly formed proletariat, by capitalism itself, which would actually bring about a change. As a matter of fact, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, Lenin gave up a lot of the Bolshevik program in order to actually adopt a lot of the Narodnik program. In particular, the Bolsheviks had a program of nationalization of land, and Lenin just abandoned it exactly at the time of the revolution in order to accept the fact that peasant community is forced through the breakup of the feudal estates, that you don't actually have nationalization of land, but rather you actually have redistribution of land in order to create a whole bunch of small producers. Now, therefore, in some sense, there is this third, this third dimension to which in India at the time, we did not have adequate debate. And what is more, as Akeel pointed out, the kind of, Indian left at that time was much more strongly mimicking, if you like, the model of Soviet industrialization and therefore ignored the peasantry. To articulate the position of the peasantry fell to the lot of someone like Charan Singh. But I believe that ultimately, in some sense, I mean, I think now the Gandhian notion of a decentralized development is something which is not only specific to Gandhi, but it is now accepted much more widely against the Nehruvian notion of centralization or the Soviet industrialization model of centralization. As a matter of fact, I think many on the left, and as a matter of fact, wherever the left has been in power, there has been very strong decentralization mechanisms which have actually been a way to carry forward the process of development. Now, therefore, in some sense, I feel that just as Lenin had looked at its third way and into that had incorporated the Narodnik demand or the Narodnik perception of land to the tiller and creating a whole range of petty producers, peasant producers, as against nationalization of land and peasant ownership as against nationalization of land. I believe it is possible for us also to think in terms of a third way where it is not, the binary is not between capitalism and the populist mode of production, but rather the struggle for going beyond capitalism, in the course of which you would actually have people coming together, and caste can be, if not transcended, but at least significantly modified, not immediately, but over a period of time in this process of coming together. For instance, one of the things one notices, I mean, these are very straws in the wind. One of the things one notices that during the year-long Kisan agitation that occurred last year, which was successful against the 3 farm laws, you actually had for the first time in this region, at any rate, by this region I mean in Haryana, in the neighborhood of Delhi and so on, not only a coming together of the Hindu and Muslim peasants, but also in some sense a coming together of the peasantry with agricultural laborers. Now, let's not forget the Jat peasants with agricultural laborers who are Dalits. The idea of Jats and Dalits coming together against an overarching draconian legislation, which the government that is trying to promote capitalism. Now, obviously, this does not mean that we would overcome caste in this way. But what it does mean is that the way forward, in some sense, to my mind, lies not in the binary that the Narodniks put forward or that even the Hind Swaraj put forward, but in some sense going beyond this binary to an alternative perception, which again has to break historically with the kind of Soviet industrialization model that was prevalent some decades ago. I think I better stop there.
All right, thank you very much. Now we will have the question and answer session. But before that, just as usual, we have to show coming week's Saturday's event. Totally different in theme. We have Mushara and the City, mapping Delhi through cultures of poetry. Professor Nishat Zaidi, Professor of English Department, Jamia Millia Islamia, and 2 other speakers for opening remarks and concluding remarks also are from Jamia Millia Islamia, Professor Anisur Rahman and Professor Farhat Nasreen. So over to Dr. Rafat Hussain for question answer session. And I believe Rafat is here. Rafat?
Yeah, thank you, Razibhai. Thank you so much. And I feel like this forum is so lucky and blessed to have 4 listed, but unfortunately, the Ashish Nandi could not attend. And these are the three renowned professionals, professors and intellectuals. So my heartiest thanks to Professor Akeel Bilgrami and Professor Uday Mehta and Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Thank you so much for your intellectual talks. And now the session is open for question and answer. Most of you know that how to ask the question. There is a digital hand, you can raise it, or you show your interest in the chat box. I will monitor the chat box as well. And let me see if there is any, of course. Satnath Chaudhary Saab, please go ahead, unmute yourself, and after that will be Faizan Muqim. And Satnath Saab, so go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks a lot for the discourse. There are lots of questions that I have, but I'm not going to ask. It will take too much time.
Thank you.
And one thing, or two things that I wanted to ask was, I've heard about Dr. Ambedkar's inclusion in the Constituent Assembly's drafting Constitution as chairman. I've tried to find out how did it happen, but I haven't gotten clear answer. Some people have asserted that it was on suggestion of Gandhi that he was made the chairman of the drafting committee. So if Professor Bilgrami or anybody else knows better, I would appreciate learning that. And the second thing is I have highest regard for Gandhi for using nonviolence for emancipation of the weaker, weak from imperial or from whatever superior forces. And how did he advise the Indian government during the 4 months, 5 months he was alive after independence regarding Kashmir conflict? I would appreciate knowing that. Of course, that's a little unrelated to his caste. He's thinking about caste. But if you know about it, I would appreciate learning, being enlightened about it.
Thank you, Chaudhary Saab.
Can we just have a few questions all together and then?
Okay. Let's see if they are similar question. Faizan Saab, go ahead. Faizan Muqim Saab.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible too? Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is about how we in pre-independent India we have movements. We have Asim Bihari. We have Abdul Qayyum Ansari who are into the discourse of Pasmanda Muslims. So how do you think Gandhi is responding to caste in Muslim community?
Yeah.
So what is yes, thank you.
Thank you. Next is Rudranshu. So we will take 3 questions at it. Go ahead, Rudranshu.
I would like to ask my question later on because then too many questions will get mixed up.
Okay, thank you. Please go ahead, Professor Bilgrami.
Okay, so on the question of, you see, my own feeling is that Gandhi's my focus is entirely on Gandhi's responses to a scenario in which he really does feel that what is important is to address caste issues. And this is forced on us by the fact that if you take his overall framework, he doesn't really have the confidence at all. I mean, you can't understand him without understanding that on the one hand, you have Jawaharlal's attitude towards caste. Jawaharlal constantly wrote to Gandhi saying, why are you so obsessed with untouchability? Why are you so obsessed with caste? It'll all go away. There are many letters from Jawaharlal which said this. It will all go away if we have a proper stress on the concept of class instead, and have not a class struggle, because Nehru wasn't, except for a few years, a revolutionary socialist. But if you address the issues of class inequality, the caste issue will dissipate. So that was one view, which Gandhi didn't believe. So in that sense, Gandhi didn't have the left ideology, which said that. On the other hand, Gandhi didn't have a different liberal attitude either that Ambedkar had, which was that what one needed was legislative reform in the form of affirmative action in order to address caste. And Gandhi did not, at least in his idealized writing, think that the embrace of liberal modernity was of that kind, was going to address the problem. He thought the problem went much deeper, and in a way, Ambedkar recognized that much later. You know, I mean, that's one way to understand his desire to convert, and so there's a sense. So Gandhi's position was neither of these positions. It wasn't the liberal position. It wasn't the left position, and so I think it's extremely important to understand that his position was so vexed, because it's not just that he had an idealized claim to how to address the caste issue, but that he was forced by developments during the freedom movement, especially after the late 20s, in which the Crown was making constitutional concessions to the Indian people, and Ambedkar was quite rightly saying, well, we've got to accept this, and we've got to have a point of view very different from Gandhi's, because we're being offered all this, and we have to step up and stand up for and promote what is possible for the Dalits, for the elimination of caste, which was the ultimate goal in annihilation of caste, which was the ultimate goal in Ambedkar. So Ambedkar was very much sort of willing to exploit, and it was part of his intellectual upbringing too, to embrace this liberal set of ideals and procedures to address the caste system. So Gandhi's position was neither of these positions. It wasn't the left position. It wasn't, and I think Gandhi's position simply had to address the sort of issues that Ambedkar was quite rightly raising once the Crown was making these constitutional concessions to self-rule, gradual self-rule, from the late 20s, 30s, mostly 30s on. So Gandhi's ambivalences really have to do with the fact that he was, I think Lenin's image of a Janus face was absolutely accurate in that sense. he had both these. He had his almost sentimental, but also intellectually quite rigorous commitments to addressing caste through internal moral resistance and social reform. The social reform in his sense, not in the sense of 19th century reformers and their legacy. And at the same time, he couldn't possibly ignore what Ambedkar was pressing, because he was leading a national movement which was stuck with the concessions that the British were offering for self-governance. And that is why I think that the way to understand it is simply to the crux of it, no doubt, came with the crisis of the Pune Pact. There's no doubt that brought to Gandhi a realization that if he's going to stick to his guns, he will have to take a stand on this. So I don't, in response to the first couple of questions, my view is that the real issue is Irfan Habib's view right or not? And I would have wanted to hear Prabhat's response to this, because I think that there is a sense in which there are two issues here, which are, for me, are very different and very crucial. You see, and I really do want to get not just Prabhat's, but other people's view of this, because I know that there's a lot of vilification of Gandhi over the Pune Pact. And I've been critical, as in my papers, in my lecture just now, of Gandhi's attitudes. But you see, what I'd really like to get from both the people who've asked questions is, and from Prabhat, is everybody's criticism of Gandhi is that he let down the Dalits because separate electorates would have given Dalits, separate electorates would have given Dalits a kind of control over their own voting procedures and whom they got to vote for. The view of the left, I think Irfan Habib represents this, that they actually got more representation as a result of the Pune Pact rather than the Communal Award. And so Gandhi's stance was justified. And the fact is that there's a cynical way of opposing the Pune Pact, which is to say, people will vote in this in-group, out-group way, and there's no sense in which a general electorate will vote because it's just cynicism. They will simply not vote with the interests of the Dalits in mind. That's why you need a separate. And my view is that Gandhi absolutely refused to give in to this cynicism. And he called it, he repeatedly said it was cynical. So now my question is, suppose you can't, there's no wholesale crime in being idealistic. There's no wholesale crime in saying, look, if there's genuine, if it's perfectly possible for a general electorate to see what's in the best interest of the worst off, the Dalits. So my criticism of Gandhi is not that he was refusing to accept the cynicism. I'm actually quite admire him for not accepting the cynicism and saying, look, there's going to be in-group, out-group thinking. We always vote with our own caste interests. So there will never be a general electorate which will vote with the interests of the Dalits in mind. But I think what Ambedkar is right about, even though he doesn't make this the explicit position that he takes, because he takes the more cynical line, is that what Gandhi is something that Gandhi himself acknowledged in various other things. Gandhi himself said, we have a failure of imagination. It's not just that we will vote cynically, it's just that we can't imagine. The general electorate cannot imagine the real nature of the suffering of the Dalit, of what he called the Harijan. So Gandhi himself, in many passages, talks of how it's not enough. He says, I would have to be reborn to understand it. He himself says it. And then when it came to this, he did not concede to Ambedkar that the general electorate lacks the imagination. Whether they're cynical or not, they lack human beings don't have boundless imagination. And I think that is the real heart of Gandhi's failure over the Pune Pact, over the issues around the communal award and the Pune Pact. And I think the left's criticism, Irfan Habib was very, very forthright on this. I think that position can't be right. But it's actually my position, I think, is not exactly the same as Ambedkar's criticism of Gandhi, but it is a cousin of it.
Thank you. Professor Bilgrami, would you please quickly touch upon the Gandhi's opinion on Kashmir conflict? That was the second question.
Well, it's not the topic for today. Actually, there's, I think, one of the very interesting questions to explore is Gandhi's position not just on the Kashmir issue, but how his position, to the extent that he spoke of Kashmir specifically, as opposed to his opposition to partition, is to see it in comparison with his position in Palestine. I think if you really want to understand Gandhi's thinking on Kashmir, you have to explore it with his fascinatingly, deeply sympathetic remarks on the Palestinians. And I think that, but there's a sense in which Gandhi, who died, he died before a whole range of issues and stands that were taken on Kashmir emerged. The fact is that Gandhi was deeply opposed to partition. Gandhi was absolutely committed to provincial autonomy, and in a way that Nehru was not. And those issues are deeply relevant to the stand that he would have taken on Kashmir as in the decade that followed after he died. You see, because you've got to understand that Nehru was against provincial autonomy of the kind that Jinnah demanded. And Gandhi's complete commitment to decentralization was never to take the Nehruvian commitments to a centralized political economy. The Nehru, Mahalanobis, and so on position was not Gandhi's position. So Gandhi was, if Gandhi had really had his way, there would be no partition. There would be no repudiating the claim that there should be a provincial autonomy, which, if Aisha Jalal and all are right, and I think Aisha Jalal really nails this down quite well in her work. It's absolutely clear that Jinnah was holding out for provincial autonomy. Gandhi was not against it, but Nehru was. And Nehru had his own undeniably genuine anxieties about provincial autonomy that would have allowed Jinnah to withdraw his demands. And Nehru's anxieties, which is not something that Gandhi was able to overcome, Nehru had a lot of backing, was quite simply that you couldn't have centralized planning, which Nehru was committed to, if you had the kind of provincial autonomy that Gandhi was prepared to have and Jinnah was demanding. And Nehru explicitly said in that famous loss of temper at the press conference that you could never get rid of the princes if you had the kind of provincial autonomy that was being demanded, and that Gandhi was also committed to. So those are the issues that are involved, and I think to ask what would Gandhi say about developments that occurred after he died is very hard to extrapolate from what he did say before he died. But those are the issues that I've just mentioned are the issues when he was alive.
Thank you, Professor. And please be brief because there are so many people lined up. So and there was Faizan asked the question about the Gandhi's view on the caste in Muslims, especially in context of Momen movement and Asim Bihar.
Yeah, so there's a lot of literature on caste divisions amongst Muslims. The best work that I've read is by Imtiaz Ahmed, and in fact there's a volume that I think Imtiaz edited some years ago, in which there's some very good articles on it, and so all I can do is direct you to read Imtiaz's own work and that volume. Just I can't remember the title, but just look up the title, and it's there's no doubt that caste enters in these ways, but the issues now are quite different. I think the issues now of Muslims and Dalits are very different from issues that were once very central, which is caste divisions within Islam. I think now the issues are different, partly because, you see, one of the things we have to understand about is the differences between Muslims and castes. It's not the central issue now, castes within Muslims. The central issue now, right now, what we're facing now, is that by and large Muslims have gone into their shells and have no real agency that they can display because of total fear and anxiety of the menace that they face under this regime. But the Dalits, I think, the caste issue now is not that it goes beyond Hinduism. That's not the main issue. The main issue right now, I believe, about caste is that there is a bizarre, though perhaps explainable, difference in the way that Dalits' political behavior surfaces in the electoral clock. In the years, in the middle of the electoral clock, before the elections approach, the Dalits show remarkable agency. They show agency of mass politics. They show agency which is genuinely oppositional. Sometimes it has been violent, and there's a very powerful resistance to an obvious upper caste, a regime that favors upper castes. But when it comes close to the electoral clock, once you move away from the long middle period between elections, between general elections, the Dalits, when it comes close to the electoral clock, when it comes close to the elections, very often succumb to what is these fly-by-night offers from the government, basically a Hindu right government that we've been landed with for the last decade or more. So they completely succumb to to electoral manipulation for the gains that they can make in the upcoming elections. So there's a sort of schizophrenic behavior. In the middle of the electoral clock, they show agency, they're often on the street at the Maidan. Then when it comes close to the electoral clock, they often get manipulated into local elections, regional elections, and so on, into voting for BJP and its allies. So this is an issue which is, so the agency seems to be limited. The agency of resistance seems to be limited to the middle of the electoral clock. But it's there in the middle of the electoral clock. There's no real resistance amongst Muslims now. They're just too afraid of the menace.
Thank you, Professor. So please allow me at least to invite a couple of people and be brief. Sunthar Visuwa Lingam Sir, and then P.K. Yadav, and after that Ravindra Kulkarni, please. Go ahead, Sunthar Sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Bilgrami, for such an illuminating exposition. My question actually focuses on the question of hierarchy. You said two things which seem to go a little bit in different directions about this. One was that, of course, one was that Gandhi saw caste as being something akin to guilds and not really hierarchical, and somehow it got corrupted. The other thing is that you raised a question, you actually relativized the notion of hierarchy by saying that one can be superior in one sense and inferior in another way. So it's still hierarchical, but it's a complex kind of hierarchy. So these are two things which one needs to reconcile. And I was just wondering, listening to you, was Gandhi in reality opposed to caste hierarchy per se, or rather to hierarchy, in quotes, understood as a linear, unidimensional construct? So I'm reminded of, Mikim Marriott here in University of Chicago, whom I know quite well. He polemicized against the abstraction of Homo hierarchicus by Louis Dumont on this very point. You see, Dumont never really lived in an Indian village, unlike Mikim Marriott, who actually lived, became part of the village. So because of this very reason, Mikim Marriott espoused instead a transactional understanding of social relations in the village, even while acknowledging and documenting their complex ranking systems. And ultimately, this led Marriott, such anthropological realizations led Marriott to reject the imposition of Western, including Marxist categories on the study of Indian peasant society, including in Chicago. So would you please comment on that? Thank you.
Thank you.
On this notion of a hierarchy, how should we understand it?
Okay, hold on. Let me invite a few more people. P.K. Yadav Saab, so please be brief and go ask the pointed question. P.K. Yadav Saab. Okay, next is Ravindra Kulkarni Gautam. And Rudranshu, I am saving you for later. Okay, Gautam Saab.
Yes, Namaskar. It was a very enriching session. My question is like, once Max Muller says caste as a political institution, it will never be finished. But as a religious institution, it will, as a social institution, it will be a kind of deteriorated in that sense. So my question is related to, yes, Gandhi talks about caste is not practice, but Gandhi's philosophy, in terms of giving importance of recognizing the institution of, arranged marriage in that sense, and traditional authority. So we can find a kind of problem in order to solve the question of casteism, because we become so happy after politicizing a kind of caste movement in terms of democracy theory. But at the same time, we become very sad after seeing the emergence of casteism in India.
Yadav Sahab, ask the question, please.
So my question is, what is the way out of the emerging complexity of caste system in India? What is the solution, be it political solution, or we can see the solution of Ambedkar, who says that we can live without caste after going out of this Hinduism.
Thank you. We got it. Thank you. So one question is on hierarchy, another one is the solution for casteism. Go ahead, please.
Right. So the excellent question about it's interesting. You said that there's a tension in my both claiming that that there was a way in which different inequalities were possible while there was before, and Gandhi said this, before monetization came and produced a single criterion for what is equal and unequal. And you said that there were different forms of it goes against the claim also that there were hierarchies. But I don't see that there is a tension. You see, I don't know who asked that question, that excellent question. I'm forgetting the name, but there isn't.
Sunthar.
Right.
Sunthar Vishnuvalingam.
So, you see, the thing is that the idea of hierarchy comes when you look on a single scale. I mean, you have a single criterion for ranking. And Gandhi's claim was that in a pluralist society, there were all sorts of ways in which you could be unequal, but the very same people could be more privileged in some other respect. And there was no way of finding a single measure for being equal and unequal. And this was a very idealized position that he had. And there is a sense in which it may well be true that that you can have all forms of all sorts of dignity that tend to get undermined if you have monetization and you begin to measure dignity with what Gandhi called wealth possession. To some extent, to this day, it hasn't completely succeeded because the most privileged caste in some localities need not be the richest class. So it doesn't quite coincide in that way. But by and large, I think Gandhi's view was that you see, I don't think Gandhi was really even trying to give a historical account. It's completely wrong to think that what he was doing when he said that in history they emerged, you have to read his words that way, he called it a corruption. So when he said it was a corruption of a non-hierarchical conception of caste, what we see today, it sounds as if it's a historical claim. So you must ask, well, what was this? When was it non-hierarchical? What was its nature of non-hierarchy and so on? And he didn't get into any historical evidence for it. So he wasn't writing like a historian or as a historian when he made that claim. So what I do in my paper is say, what was he claiming when he said that there was once caste, which was sheer heterogeneity, it's my way of putting it, and not hierarchy. And my claim was that he was not talking as a historian, presenting evidence for it at all. He wasn't doing what Kosambi did. He was, for instance, but what he did instead was to deploy it as in just the way, to talk of a conjectural past, in just the way that, for instance, political theorists from the 17th century on did with the idea of a social contract. Nobody made a social contract in history of the kind that they're talking about, that Hobbes talked about, Locke talked about, or Rawls for that matter. So what was intended by that? What was intended by that was that you posited something as a theoretical concept, a theoretical term, in the way that, for instance, scientists might posit a theoretical term. And the idea was to deploy that as a posited conjectural history, not actual history, with a view to making critical remarks and come to a critical understanding of other things. And my idea was you should treat his idea of caste as sheer heterogeneity in having something of the theoretical function, say, that Hobbes and Locke have for the idea of a social contract. And what he's doing is to use that to understand why it is that a certain understanding of capitalist modernity is not going to be the right answer to addressing what did develop, according to him, in history, which is the corruption of this non-hierarchical heterogeneity into a hierarchy of what we now know in the modern sense of caste as hierarchy. And he used this ideal to say, well, if you have this ideal, certainly you're not going to have that ideal realized by the kinds of developments that Marx proposed in Primitive Accumulation to undermine primordial hierarchies. Caste was not prominent in Marx's mind, but religious schisms and tribes were. So I'm just, in my paper, what I do is to use Gandhi's remarks about a non-hierarchical conception of caste as a concept of conjectural history with the same function that, for instance, social contract theorists had when they talked of a contract. And the function that he had in mind was to deploy it in saying that standard understandings of how capitalist modernity and liberal democratic institutions of the kind that Ambedkar was advocating, which were for Gandhi necessarily linked with capitalist modernity, would not be sufficient. Excuse me.
So
was he writing rather as an anthropologist from his lived experience, something like, though without the academic qualifications of somebody like Mickey Marriott?
Well, I don't know. I'm just
an anthropologist rather than a historian, I meant.
I'm just writing about Gandhi, and I'm saying Gandhi was not a historian. Absolutely not. That's right. He was not a historian and not pretending to be a historian. In fact, not even doing what Jawaharlal did in the discovery of India. He was just not. He was not even in that lay popular form doing history of that kind. He had a much more theoretical purpose. He wanted to deploy the idea of caste as mere heterogeneity and for critical theoretical assessments of other claims and of actual developments of hierarchy.
thank you,
Right.
Professor Bilgrami. How long you can stay with us? Because I wanted to invite Rajmohan Gandhi Saab for the final comment. Because
yes, please.
Yeah, Razi bhai.
He
So
left. He left.
Oh, okay, sorry. So the another question was on the solution for casteism. Gautam Saab asked that question. Any potential solution?
Oh, solution. I'm, as I said, this is not the occasion to, for me to take up enormously large issues of that kind. This paper was intended to be just focused on Gandhi, and
that is perfect.
But you know, I have some sympathy with a great sympathy with some of the things that Professor Patnaik has written. All I can do is suggest that. May I suggest just something that you might read? So Professor Patnaik and I wrote something together on the concept of belonging, and he wrote on caste, and I wrote on Muslim identity and religious identity. This was focused on India, and I can suggest this is something that Amartya Sen had started, called the International Panel of Social Progress, and we wrote a long paper. It was a 60-page paper. He and I together, along with James Tully and another person I'm forgetting, on the question of caste as belonging. Prabhat Patnaik wrote it, and it was contextualized in a more general framework in my remarks, and I'd just recommend that to you. It's called the International Panels on Social Progress. It's edited by Ravi Kanbur and Mark Flaubert, and ours is a long chapter in there on caste as belonging, amongst other things as belonging.
Thank you so much. So 2 more questions, and then finally I will touch upon with the Rudranshu. Ravinder Kulkarni Saab and Dennis Saab. So Ravinder Saab, please go ahead. Is he there?
Ravinder Kulkarni, I can see him.
Yeah. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah. Unmute yourself, please. Yeah.
Ravinder Kulkarni. So I ask you to unmute.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Yes.
Yeah, is it okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it was a wonderful talk, Akeel. I learned quite a few things from you in this talk. But would you compare the removal of untouchability to removal of conversion doctrines in Islam and Christianity? Both are kind of higher forms of nonviolence, and Gandhi was opposed to both of them.
Yes. Yes, Gandhi was opposed to both of them, and of course, Ambedkar conversion at the end was which is a very complex and interesting set of issues here. Gandhi was against conversion because, well, he wasn't against conversion completely, but he thought it required a great deal of reflection and not just it shouldn't be done in haste and impulsively. See, one of the things you simply have to acknowledge is that Gandhi was, in some ways, like Burke, he was committed to the idea that if something is given to you, you don't just upturn it, without an enormous amount of reflection. So what is given to you is, in some sense, so constitutive of you that you can't just overturn it overnight or unreflectively, and it has to be done with a great deal of reflection. And I believe that Ambedkar's conversion was done after a great. Ambedkar broke his lion's heart over legislation. He absolutely, he saw himself as a bitter and total failure towards the end of his life because he had placed so much emphasis on legislation. You mustn't forget that there is a remarkable, Ambedkar had, there were moments where Ambedkar was the leader of a mass movement. But increasingly, as the Crown offered concessions of a constitutional reform, Ambedkar moved away from movements, movements mobilizing Dalits, to a constitutional form of addressing the caste question. And so when so much was invested by Ambedkar in the legislative domain, and he felt he had worked, just heroically with so much intelligence, so much remarkable knowledge and commitment, and legislation didn't work, and he realized that Gandhi was in some sense right, that it was necessary, as Gandhi himself explicitly said, legislation is necessary, but it's not sufficient. I think Ambedkar's sort of falling in the end, relying on conversion as the last hope, was in a way a concession to what Gandhi had said. Now, I think that Gandhi would have seen this at the end of his life. Ambedkar's doing this was a matter of much reflection. And as I said, there was a lion's heart. For decades he had worked on this, and it was a broken heart. And so I think that Gandhi would not have had the attitudes he had about conversion for what Ambedkar did at the end of his life. But he certainly had that attitude if you had adopted conversion very early on. Gandhi was opposed to it just because he said, like Burke, he said, what is given to you simply can't just be overturned unreflectively.
Yeah, but Ambedkar conversion was kind of within Hinduism. If you consider Buddhism also a kind of very much a part of Hinduism. But the conversion doctrines in Islam and Christianity, they are supported economically.
No, I think Ambedkar was very bitter about Hinduism. That's not right. He was extremely bitter about Hinduism, and quite rightly.
Okay, so we have only 2 or 3 more minutes. I'm gonna to read a question from Mr. Dennis. Did Indian Marxists, starting with M.N. Roy, have any meaningful resolution of the genus-based problem that Professor Bilgrami has brilliantly posed? I completely agree that it is a failure of imagination. So do you concur with Judith Butler's use of this term in her Force of Nonviolence?
No, Judith's written a new book on nonviolence, which I haven't read, so I can't comment on that. I've noticed that she's just written a book. In fact, I got it in the mail the other day, so I can't comment on that. It's until I read it.
Thank you. Oh, so here is the last question or comment from Rudranshu Singh, and then we will wrap up the program. I will pass on to Raziuddin, Dr. Raziuddin. Rudranshu, please go ahead.
Well, my question would be that was Gandhi a confused man as far as caste was concerned?
Did you pay attention to my paper?
Yes, I did.
So what you mean the ambivalences? You're saying are confusions?
Not in your question, but he is asked.
I'm asking a question to you. According to you, was Gandhi a confused man as far as caste was concerned, or was there any clarity of vision?
Just perfectly clear. I mean, he was ambivalent, and I think the ambivalences were forced on him by the fact that constitutional concessions were being made, and he had to address them. And so he was brought into line with certain kind of liberal thinking. And at the same time, he had these visionary hopes of a form of governance and a form of state for India, which was not liberal. And so there were these ambivalences. Confusion isn't the word I use, but perhaps it led to confusions. But I think ambivalences is the better word.
Yes. Okay, thank you, sir.
All
Okay, thank you. Let me somebody ask. So Dennis Saab, do you have any additional question? What?
let's wrap it up.
Okay, please go ahead and back to you, Razi bhai. And thank you so much, Professor Bilgrami Saab. It's always a pleasure to hear you. And thank you for coming back on our forum. And we look forward to see you again.
On and on, yes, of course. Always, he's so gracious in this one. Anytime we request, he's available. And we really benefit so much with this, such a deep, researched, inspiring lecture. It throws a lot of questions to you, and you also inhale a lot and digest a lot from this kind of intellectual, talks. So thank you very much, Bilgrami Sahab, Prabhat ji, and others. I wish Ashish Nandi were here, but it is almost 2 hours and 15 minutes. That's a lot to cover, and we must be feeling very, very tired now. Please drink some water or whatever, because it seems like your throat is, affecting your talk. Anyway, thank you so much. No more questions. And I'm sure to write to you back in another few months and time to say totally different onto different subject matter. But certainly we always enjoy your lectures.
No doubt.
Thank you, Prabhaji, very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Prabhaji. And
and hope to see you guys again. Thank you a lot. Okay, bye. It's quite late in India. For Indians, it's quite late. Ravi Saab, just sleep. Just all right. Thank you. Bye.
yeah, Ravi Saab, I'm sorry. I wish to have
Rajmohan, Rajmohan Gandhi Saab just left. Aditya Mukherjee was here. Anand Patwardhan is still here. So there are a lot of people who really covered. Zoya Hassan was here. So it's a good company. And pretty much, a lot. Subhash Gadeke is here, is still here. If you want to engage, but this is too late. I think this is too much.
Yeah, but it was a very good attendance, Razi bhai.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Thank you.
Professor Bilgrami, can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you
Dennis.
hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Please come back to Portland. We miss you. I'm coming to you from Oregon, and you haven't been here for several years. You uplifted the intellectual quality of our city. We would like to have you return.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Dennis.
All right. Now let's end the meeting and say bye.